Thank you for joining us. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on the corporate ownership of housing. My name is Leah Hendy, and I'm a Principal Research Associate in the Urban Institute's Housing and Communities Division and co-director of the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, known as NNIP. Before I start, I'd like to walk you through the agenda and go over a few housekeeping items. I'll begin with a presentation to set up the panel discussion, which will be moderated by my co-host, David Greenberg, Vice President of Community Research and Impact at the Local Initiative Support Corporation, or LISC. We'll aim to save about 15 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A box to submit your questions for the panelists. We are recording today's webinar, and it will be shared with attendees as well as posted on the event page on urban.org. The slides and biographies for today's speakers are already up on the page. Live captions are enabled. You're welcome to turn them off if you would prefer not to have them during the webinar. Urban is the national partner in NNIP, a network of local organizations in more than 30 cities whose mission for nearly 30 years has been to help communities use data to shape strategies and investments so that all neighborhoods are places where people can thrive. Our partners support local priorities by connecting communities with the data they need and the help they need to use it. I know many of you are familiar with LISC, but for those who aren't, LISC is one of the country's largest community development organizations with 36 local offices. LISC works with residents and partners to close gaps in health, wealth, and opportunity so that people and places can thrive. Over the past few years, we have heard from local partners across our NNIP network that they were getting requests from their collaborators to try to understand the prevalence of investors in the housing market and what effect they were having. Similarly, the Community Research and Impact team at LISC, which conducts studies to evaluate the impact of LISC initiatives and public policies and to inform programmatic and policy change, they've been hearing from their local offices on the topic. We are co-hosting today's webinar to share from both our networks on the impact of corporate ownership of both single-family and multifamily housing on residents and housing markets, and to elevate the discussion about how we can develop policies and encourage practices that support investment that results in stronger neighborhoods and improved outcomes for residents. Along with concerns raised about investors and corporate owners that we've heard, there's a lot of frustration. Our partners are adept at analyzing local housing data and administrative records, but it's very challenging to identify the ultimate owners in many cases, making it difficult for tenants and jurisdictions alike to engage with them when issues do arise. This example is from one of our Boston NNIP partners, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, or MAPC, on a project that one of our panelists, Alexa, has been working on. An investor, whether it's an individual or corporation, may use a limited liability corporation, or LLC, to purchase a property for a variety of reasons that make good business sense, including tax benefits and limiting personal liability. However, doing so makes it impossible to understand quickly who owns properties in the area. MAPC's research classified investors by the size of their purchase portfolio, but they knew that a critical limitation of that classification was that many LLC owners were inaccurately classified as small because they only had one purchase under a given name, even if they were known to be connected to other larger or individually named LLCs via shared beneficiaries. This diagram illustrates a hypothetical example, but based on a real LLC that is actually connected to 32 other LLCs and 111 properties purchased between 2001 and 2022. For a total portfolio of $154 million. To address this issue, MAPC worked with researchers at MIT and Northeastern to apply a network analysis developed by MIT professor Eric Robsky-Huntley to MAPC's home sale transaction data. Dr. Robsky-Huntley's methods connected LLCs with mutual beneficiaries to each other as megacorps. MAPC was able to connect the LLC purchasers in the transaction data to their corresponding megacorps. They then could do more accurately classify the size of LLC owner purchase portfolios. The reclassification of transactions using megacorps as owners resulted in a large shift out of the small size category and a corresponding shift upward, mostly to the institutional category. MAPC is continuing to iterate on the research to get more complete results and is releasing a white paper on the phase 2 analysis in the next day or so. Urban, LISC, and local NNIP partners and a number of researchers have been trying to piece together information to understand the prevalence of corporate-owned housing and different investor types. Given the difficulty of identifying owners, these estimates likely represent the lower bound of the presence of corporate owners. The foreclosure crisis created a unique opportunity for a new class of investment in housing. Institutional investors with ready access to capital were able to bulk purchase large inventories of single-family homes in many areas of the country and turn them into rental properties, which helped stabilize neighborhoods in many cases. However, corporate ownership of single-family housing has since expanded. My colleague Lori Goodman and her team's research indicates that among the top 20 metro areas for single-family rental, the institutional investor share of the single-family rental properties in 2022 ranged from 6.9% in the St. Louis metro area to 28.6% in Atlanta. And GAO estimates that the 5 largest investors owned about 300,000 single-family homes nationally in 2022. Our NNIP partner at UNC Charlotte's Urban Institute looked at how the number and share of single-family homes owned by corporations had changed in Mecklenburg County since 2010. They found that the percentage of single-family homes owned by corporations, the line on the chart, increased from about 10% of homes in 2010 to 26% in 2023. Another reason we need good granular data to understand how corporate owners are investing and what might be the effect of their investment is that they don't make investments uniformly across communities. Goodman et al.'s national study indicates that mega institutional investors were more concentrated in high-income tracts on average than more regionally focused local investors. Our Kansas City NNIP partner, the Mid-America Regional Council, found that just 5 companies own nearly 8,000 properties in the region. And even though that's a fraction of all single-family homes in the area, the concentration of ownership means that they can have a larger impact on the neighborhoods and cities they're concentrated in. This heat map is of mega investors in single-family rentals, that is, those with more than 500 properties in the region. Similar to Goodman's national study, Mark found that the comparison with other owners with at least 10 properties, these owners were more likely to concentrate in census tracts with newer housing and populations that were predominantly white and higher income. Goodman's 2023 research indicates that corporate investors in single-family housing are not monolithic. Their business strategies, how long they hold properties, what investments they make in them, what types of properties they buy, and which neighborhoods they invest in vary. This is another reason it's critical to have access to data to understand the nuances for your own community. The maps on this slide are from a paper by researchers at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, or CURA, at the University of Minnesota, our Twin Cities NNIP partner. They show the location quotients for investor-owned single-family rentals by census tract in Hennepin and Ramsey counties, with private equity owners, real estate investment trusts, or REITs, and rent-to-own owners. Tan indicates the owner type is underrepresented relative to the area, and darker green indicates they're overrepresented. You can see that each owner type has a distinct pattern. Private equity is predominantly concentrated in North Minneapolis, a low-income neighborhood with predominantly single-family homes that was hit hard by the foreclosure crisis. REIT ownership is more prevalent in the suburban communities, while RTO properties are found in higher income communities in the outer suburbs and the ex-urban areas of the counties. To date, less research has been focused on large corporate ownership's prevalence in the multifamily market, and more work is needed in this area. In MIPC's Homes for Profit research in the Boston area, they found increasing investor purchases of 2- and 3-family buildings. LISC, in their Buying the Block report, focused on multifamily housing of at least 5 units in the Kansas City region and found that corporate owners, defined as owning at least 100 units in the region, owned almost 4 and 5 multifamily units. Corporate owners are also more likely to hold larger properties than non-corporate owners. Local tenants and elected officials raised concerns about out-of-town investors being less accountable to their needs in the community. And LISC found that nearly half of multifamily units were owned by corporations located outside of their region. Consolidation and concentration of ownership has the potential to drive up home prices and rents, and business practices and property management styles can have a dramatic impact on tenants, their quality of life, and their neighborhoods. In the next few slides, I'll share some examples of our networks of the outcomes we've been able to look at. In the Twin Cities region, Damiano and Goetz's aptly named study, Does Size Matter?, answers the question in the affirmative. They find after controlling for neighborhood and housing unit characteristics, the likelihood of a unit receiving an eviction filing increases as the size of the portfolio increases. Tenants with private equity and RTO landlords are about 17% more likely to have an eviction filed on them than tenants living in a property whose owner has just one unit. These are the blue bars on the graph. Tenants living in homes owned by REITs are 26% more likely to have an eviction filed against them. These findings also hold when looking at eviction judgments, which are in the black bars on the graph. Living in a property owned by a REIT has the largest marginal effect, followed by private equity and rent to own. In earlier work, the Family Housing Fund and Cura collaborated to survey tenants in North Minneapolis, the neighborhood with a high concentration of private equity-owned single-family units. They found that rent increases and higher utility costs were more likely in properties with large investor owners than in properties owned by a micro owner. Residents in large owner homes also generally lived in worse conditions, with repairs less likely to be completed. Cura also linked the survey properties with data on code violations and found more violations were issued in homes owned by large investors. The research also found that Black and Latinx respondents reported higher rates of perceived discrimination and retaliation from large landlords than white respondents. Family Housing Fund and Cura have collaborated to expand their survey to cover Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Bloomington, and are releasing a new report soon that corroborates the experiences of tenants in North Minneapolis. Across all dimensions that they measured, including rents paid, fees, discrimination, and housing conditions, large landlords scored much worse than smaller landlords, even after controlling for tenant, neighborhood, and housing unit characteristics. LISC found in their Buying the Block study, narrowed in on Kansas City, Missouri, that corporate owners of multifamily properties file evictions at 3.7 times the rate of smaller owners over the 5-year study period. The authors suggest that given this difference holds after accounting for property and neighborhood characteristics, the result is due to differences in management practices and business strategies. They also note that out-of-area landlords filed evictions at rates 3 times as high as local landlords. Similar to the maintenance concerns found in the Twin Cities among single-family properties, LISC found that healthy homes code violations, things like leaks or fire risk, mold, or pests, were 1.5 times more likely to be reported for corporate owners of multifamily properties in Kansas City than for non-corporate investors, also controlling for neighborhood characteristics and demographics. More research is also needed on the impact of investors on the price and homes of rents. MAPC in their Homes for a Profit work looked at properties that were flipped in the Boston region. They found large and institutional investors were the most likely to flip properties, taking lower priced homes off the market and then selling them at much higher prices. They noted that these flips make it very difficult for the average family to purchase a property. This graph shows for single-family homes the median % difference in sales price from the initial purchase by someone who then resold that property within 2 years by owner type. MAPC found that the median price differential was much higher for investors than non-investors. Since 2010, investors who flip properties were reselling properties for 60 to 80% more than they bought them for. In contrast, non-investors who bought and sold within 2 years were only reselling their properties for 10 to 20% more. It was not possible for MAPC to quantify the dollars invested into improving these flipped properties, but the impact on the market is significant nonetheless. With that context, I'm excited to introduce today's panel to talk about how better data and understanding of corporate ownership can be used to support policies and practices that help strengthen neighborhoods and support improved outcomes for tenants. I invite them to join me on camera. David Greenberg, Vice President of Community Research and Impact at LISC, will be moderating the panel. He will be joined by Devin Culbertson, Vice President of Innovative Finance at Grounded Solutions Network, Alexa DeRosa, a Regional Planning Data Analyst at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and Tara Raghavir, Director of the Tenant Union Federation and KC Tenants.
Thank you so much, Aaliyah, for that excellent overview of the issue and for sharing about NNIP Partners' excellent research. Thanks also to Urban for co-hosting this webinar. So yes, I'm David Greenberg from the Local Initiative Support Corporation, which, as Leah said, is a national community development nonprofit that operates in every state and several U.S. territories. We help build and preserve affordable housing, and we support community organizations' efforts to grow small businesses and support youth and access quality jobs and services and more. And so from my perch as the head of research at National, I've really had the privilege of seeing our community partners' efforts around the country to combat the effects of harmful investment from residents of manufactured housing communities in small towns to tenants organizing to take control of their buildings in our nation's largest cities. All of which is to say that I'm really grateful to hear from our panelists today who are doing incredibly important work around tenant organizing, scalable mission-driven investments, and research. So let's start with some tenant and organizing perspectives from Tara Raghavir. Tara, could you tell us about the work of TUF as it relates to corporate landlords? What have tenants in Kansas City and other TUF locations been experiencing lately? How are you seeing them move toward action? And can you tell us a little bit about the strategies that they've been deploying?
Thanks so much, David. And thank you to Lisk and Urban for having us. Super excited to be in conversation with all of you today. As David said, my name is Tara Raghavir. I'm the director of the Tenant Union Federation, which was founded just last year, built on years of organizing in the tenant movement. It was founded to really hone a new kind of practice of tenant organizing because under the circumstances that Leah described, we sort of can't use the same playbook that tenants have been using for years and years if we want to be serious about contesting against the forces that we are indeed up against. So TUF is a national union of tenant unions. We were founded last year, as I said, by 5 locals: KC Tenants, the union that I helped start in Kansas City, Missouri; Louisville Tenants in Kentucky; Bozeman Tenants in Montana; Southside Together on the south side of Chicago; and the Connecticut Tenants Union. And as I said, I think a lot of our project right now is understanding what we mean when we say tenant union and how we actually practice the work of organizing tenants. And a lot of our motivation right now is we believe that the tenant union must be for poor and working class people in the 21st century what the labor union was for poor and working class people in the beginning part of the 20th century, which is to say we see ourselves in a sweet but urgent moment to define what the union is, what it can be, and to refine an organizing methodology. So to take you into a little bit of our analysis, a lot of what Leah described really brings you up to speed on what tenants are dealing with right now. You all know this, but just to say, the rent is the biggest bill in most working people's budgets, and the rent is too damn high. And it has been for a long time, but something's got to give. We're arriving at a moment where I'm seeing tenants in Independence, Missouri, Raytown, Missouri, at the very edge of what they can do under the current circumstances and with very, very few places left to go. And this story, of course, has everything to do with power: who has it and who doesn't, who sets the rules and who has to comply, who calls the shots and who deals with the consequences. We see today's housing market as a catastrophic failure that has been shaped by the relentless prioritization of those who profit from our homes. So today's tenant struggle is much more real than ever before. And as Leah laid out so brilliantly in the opening, tenants are not just up against old school landlords. We're facing a class of investors who have turned our rent and our lives and the buildings in which we live into a casino where they're placing bets. And to us, this is about what we call the landlord tenant contradiction, the inherent conflict of interest between tenants and the individuals or institutions that own our homes. The tenant's primary interest is in a safe and secure place to live, and the landlord's primary interest is in their bottom line. And in today's market, those interests are misaligned more often than not. When we talk about this contradiction, it's not about the inherent goodness or badness of either party involved. It's about a system that allows one of our fundamental needs to become an investment vehicle. And as I said, it's about power. So for us, getting serious about power as tenants, and specifically the power that tenants will need in order to win under today's conditions, has meant honestly developing a curiosity and some basic fluency around housing finance, kind of unsexy and complicated thing that I think tenant organizing has not taken that seriously before. In the last couple of years, what that meant for us is that we got interested in, again, a very unsexy corner of the federal government, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, the top regulator overseeing the $150 billion in business that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac do with our landlords every year. And for years, we tried to get FHFA to consider a set of regulations, specifically tenant protections and even more specifically rent regulations that could be attached as conditions to some of these federally backed loans. We weren't successful. Spoiler, we didn't get the things that we wanted. We got some of the things, but not the full package. And that led us to apply our first big organizing swing. So last year we started organizing in a set of properties with federally backed loans. We were organizing majority unions, meaning 50% of the building plus one in a union. And we were trying to get those buildings to get strike ready. And ultimately, we launched 2 rent strikes, both in the Missouri area, in buildings with these federal loans. And we learned a lot from that first big swing. One of the main lessons was that our energy was a little too dispersed. We were targeting the federal lender, but a lot of different landlords. So that leads us to our second big swing. We're in it right now. We're taking on 1 corporate landlord's portfolio. The landlord is Capita Realty Group, a New York-based corporate landlord, major recipient of HUD support. They own somewhere between 14,000 and 22,000 units in 28 states. We don't know the specifics around their portfolio because, as Leah laid out, a lot of that is obscured from us as tenants. And we've launched not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, not 6, but 7 majority unions in their portfolio since the beginning of August, and there's more to come. So now we're organizing in over 1,000 units that Capital Realty Group owns. This is the largest portfolio-based organizing at this scale in history. We got to the bargaining table with the landlord after the first 2 unions launched, and we haven't been able to get back. So we're kind of mid-swing on this effort. There's a lot that we have left to learn, but this is a little bit of what we're doing under these circumstances.
Thank you so much for sharing that really powerful work and powerful reflections about the connection between housing finance and tenant power. We'll hear more about that in a little bit. But on the subject of mission-driven finance, let's turn to Devin Culbertson. So, Devin, what motivated Grounded Solutions to get into this space in terms of pressures that have been posed by corporate landlords to communities? And can you talk a little bit about your investment strategy in the Homes for the Future program and a little bit about how you're seeing it play out so far?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Thanks for having me on and giving the chance to talk a little bit about our work. So just for general context, Grounded Solutions is a national membership organization. We've got about not quite 300 members across the country in 46 states. And those members have single-family homes that they operate in the context of shared equity and permanent affordability, and then rental portfolios as well. And what they also really share in common is that almost all of them are really looking to grow and make those opportunities available to more folks in their communities, but don't really have the resources to do that in terms of subsidy from their local budgets. So the impetus for a lot of our investigation here and exploration was really this request by our members to open up different channels to grow those portfolios and to create more opportunities for the folks that are asking for them in their communities. And so our approach to really looking at the context of the investor ownership has really been around certainly around the single family side, but really thinking less about kind of the regulatory framework that Tara was just describing, and more about the ownership framework and how we can move into an ownership position and what we can do from that vantage point to be able to ultimately take control of some of these portfolios. And then over time, transition those into long-term permanent affordability through community land trusts, shared equity organizations, and the like. So that's sort of the kind of the inroad that we bring. Over the last couple of years, we've learned a lot about some of the context that Leah was describing in terms of just the just all the different nuance and all the different sort of niche roles of different investors at different scales, of different sort of business practices with different capital sources, and really found that there are some there's a real spread there. And part of the reason that we were doing that research is that we also saw the growth of the single family rental is not new, but the institutional scale of it is, and that is really this housing disruption that cuts both ways. I think it yields a lot of the things that Leah was describing from the research, but it also creates this really sort of scaled and efficient way of operating that's not sort of in a way that's zero sum to tenants, but is just truly more efficient in its day-to-day operations. And so we've been really looking for partners that we can invest with and work with and use as operating partners that can bring kind of a high integrity but efficient model to the work that we're doing. And so the mechanics are we're raising capital directly, and through a subsidiary of Grounded Solutions, the Homes for the Future Fund, we're acquiring those portfolios. We're holding those as rentals for a time because typically those are already rentals and we can't immediately convert them. But over time, we're amortizing the acquisition cost of those units. And we're also really focusing on communities where incomes are rising. And so purchasing power is rising over time. And over that 5 to 10 year window that we're looking at, depending on the project size and economics, we're able to transition those incrementally as the economics allow, as the tenants are ready, and as our local partners can take those on into that permanent affordability. So that's really the way that we think about the opportunity here in the context, and it really stems from this question of sort of who owns an asset really matters, right? There's the experience in it, there's the monthly cost of it, but over time, when we look at home prices or asset prices rising over time, that is financial value that's accruing to someone. And we're really focused on making sure that there are different ways and different opportunities for folks to own the places that they live and have those financial benefits stay closer to the dirt where they sit.
Thank you. Really, really appreciate those reflections. So, operating at scale, in ways that create efficiencies, similar to large investors, but in a non-extractive way, so as to benefit residents and your members of the Grounded Solutions Network. So let's turn to Alexa and zoom a little bit into the Boston and Massachusetts context. Leah talked about it a bit, but this gets, I think, to the question that Devin was raising about who profits when assets rise. And particularly struck by your finding, by MAPC's finding about the volume of flipping that was happening in the Boston Metro in the past 25 years. And that so many properties that are bought by large investors are resold, sometimes for up to 80%, 85%, as much as what they more than what they purchased for within 2 years, and how this impacts affordability across the region. What else have you seen in terms of your recent research on corporate landlords that you want to bring to the conversation? And maybe, Leah's first slide was it's hard to know who owns what, and Tara was referring to this as well. What would you say about data and transparency needs for ordinary people and for government to wrap our arms around the scope of the problem?
Thanks, David. I'm Alexa, and just for folks who don't know, MAPC is the regional planning agency for Greater Boston. So we've been doing this work at the state level to understand some of those questions of who owns what, who's profiting off of our homeownership, and how do those large-scale owners contribute to the skyrocketing housing prices that we've been seeing. In the first phase of our Homes for Profit research, our headline finding was that 1 in 5 properties in Greater Boston were purchased by an investor in the 20 years that we were looking at. We saw in that time, as Leah mentioned, a steady increase of investor ownership in single-family homes, while investor ownership of those multifamily 2 and 3 family properties doubled in the same time period. So the properties with more units definitely seeing even more significant increases in those large-scale investor ownerships. And again, like Leah did a great job introducing our research. Our big issue was understanding what's really happening behind those LLC buyers. What looks like one purchase by one LLC can actually be a purchase by a network that owns 100 buildings under 50 different LLCs. The update to our research is trying to dig into that issue a little bit more, and Leo shared the slide of our initial findings there, where with even just a partial understanding of some of those LLC networks, we've seen 10,000 more institutional size investors than what we had originally. So what looks like a small LLC is often a much larger corporation. The scale of those investors matters for all of the reasons Leah laid out. Large-scale corporate owners have been found to have disproportionately high rates of evictions, code violations, housing inadequacies. So it's really important for us to understand where those owners exist, what neighborhoods are they buying in, what kinds of properties do they own, to be able to create policies and programs to kind of address any harms that could come out of that. In our original research, we didn't have the data we needed to really dig into that question. And as we've been able to get it more recently, but it's not publicly available. We have data from that we purchase or data that we've been given access to as researchers that is not public. And data like eviction data, corporate records, are things that you're able to search in the state of Massachusetts as a one-off. Like I can look up an LLC and see who's behind it, but the bulk access that we need to do research, that a municipality needs to understand who's operating there, is just not something that we have right now. Our current work identifying ownership networks relies on that data, and obtaining it just continues to be difficult. For the policy priorities we laid out in our Homes for Profit work across mitigating impacts of investment, providing housing assistance, generating new resources, those writing good policy in all of those areas depends on us getting access to this data. So what we're really looking for is statewide policy and practice around data transparency and data sharing, especially around corporate records, evictions, and code violations, so that we can better understand the causes and effects of the housing crisis we're seeing in Massachusetts and in the country at large, and design the best policies to address it. This includes, like I mentioned, that bulk data sharing of data the state already collects, as well as having better standards around data municipalities collect, like code violations, and making sure that data is being aggregated by the state and shared back out with the public.
Thank you. Really appreciate your pointing out transparency as a kind of policy solution if it is challenging, and we know from experience as well how hard it is to just understand who owns what using specialized data sources that are not available to tenants or even government, and how hard it is to trace ownership between LLCs, how much more so for a tenant in properties to find that out when they are not doing this as their full-time job. So maybe we'll bring in all of the panelists for some questions for everyone. I wanted to talk about context. So we have here work going around in different parts of the country, and I think some of the questions in the Q&A point to this as well. Local policy, state policy really matters in the work that each of you do. Where are you seeing powerful or important levers that support or advance your work at the state or local level? And are there policies or programs or financing tools that are managed by state or local government that you would highlight as particularly important right now as you do your organizing, your research, or as you build portfolios of permanently affordable housing?
I'll take a first crack at it. I previewed some of this in my first comment, but I think a lot of what we think about and talk about is in this kind of regulatory framework. And as we've started to learn more about housing finance, I think at every level, from federal to state to local, there's a lot of opportunity to apply a much more robust regulatory framework to the way that we think about financing and the role that the public sector plays as a financing partner that makes the affordable housing business possible in many ways. And I want to talk about the regulatory side of this, but I also want to talk about ownership and supply and creation, kind of engaging in conversation with what Devin brought up before. Basically, I think a lot of what our work comes down to is recognizing the role that the public sector already plays in making affordable housing possible. And we want to see strings attached to the multiple forms of public benefit that private landlords and developers get. And those strings can include things like rent regulations in some places, eviction protections in other places. And there's also enforcement actions that public sector entities can take once they've played a role in helping to finance. One example of this related to the campaign that I just described is that Capital Realty Group has a set of properties in the Kansas City area where we're organizing as part of this national campaign. One of those properties is a property called Parker Square Apartments, and it's home to several hundred families, mostly immigrant families on the east side of Kansas City in the northeast neighborhood. And the Port Authority of Kansas City has $32 million in bond financing that was meant to go to a renovation at this property in the last couple of years. If you ask the tenants, they're not sure where any of that money went, and they're living with the consequences of a unfulfilled mandate to renovate the property. But the Port Authority has a huge amount of leverage over this owner. So the Port Authority heard after the tenants launched a union at the beginning of September, and to their credit, as an investment agency, as an incentive agency in Kansas City, they reached out without us even asking them. They reached out to the owner directly and said, hey, we need you to account for this set of things that we're hearing from, the residents of this property in Kansas City. And they're the only entity that's received any engagement directly from the CEO of Capital Realty Group in the last month and a half. And through the Port Authority, we've now gained a lot more information about where Capital Realty Group is. The head of the Kansas City Port Authority just came to the property the other day and did a tour with tenants. They're instigating another investigation there. So it's that type of leverage that I think public agencies can exercise more fully when they are actually a financing partner with landlords or developers. On the supply side, I think it's not just about kind of punishing and holding landlords accountable or, reining their business in. I also think there's a way that the public sector just needs to be much more visionary about this role. There is a role that every public sector agency plays in making housing creation possible, in preserving affordable housing that exists. And I actually think, as opposed to just waiting for developers and landlords to tell the public sector what they need from them, the public sector actually needs to approach the private sector with a vision. This is the number of units at this level of affordability that we need in Kansas City. And if you want to come in and partner with us, these are our expectations, but also here's the amazing benefit that you get as a partner with the city. So it's more the public sector, I wish all the time, was taking that leverage more seriously and being more proactive and more visionary in their approach to the private sector, acknowledging that those partnerships are just already existing. But often the public sector, I think, is sort of hostage to the terms of the private sector. And actually, we just need to reverse how that situation plays out. And one small example of this in Kansas City is, we had an emergency situation in a property where we were organizing some years ago. And the solution ended up being, we went to the city manager and we asked him to use some of his discretionary fund to get in and help us keep the tenants in their homes. This is totally off the books, and I'll probably get in trouble by some of the Kansas City people on the call who are like, wait, how did you cut this deal? But what it meant was that for 2.5 years, tenants in the northeast of Kansas City have been living in their homes that were renovated and now up to code. They're paying $400 in rent. and the city is coming in at $450. So the landlord is collecting $850 in rent, which is what he wanted to collect from these properties, but not what the tenants could afford. Because there's city and money involved, there's a lease that is much, much stronger in terms of protecting the tenants than it ever would have been before, right? So this is just applying to 20 families in Kansas City today. This should apply in a much broader scale if the city had some more vision in terms of how they could initiate these types of partnerships.
Thank you. So really, I think calling out the power that public agencies have through subsidy, through regulatory agreements, just levers that exist in our market that could be deployed effectively on behalf of tenants and communities. Devin, I'm wondering if you have any reflections about the kinds of, since Tara mentioned subsidy, about local subsidy or local policies that enable the transition from corporate ownership to community and tenant ownership.
Yeah, I just saw me sort of feverishly nodding along as Tara was describing kind of like the importance of a public sector vision and what you want to see in your community. And I think that's also over time, right? I think folks, having spent time as a developer myself, like you ask for what's good for you, right? And so the volume of resources that the public sector has access to and routinely brings into transactions, I think make those transactions pencil in a certain sense. But the question that you'll hear me asking early and often is, yeah, but who owns it, right? And so if you bring reduced cost financing and you're allowing someone to amortize their debt over a 20, 30, 40-year period, like where is that value accruing? Like who are you building assets for? And I think that having a vision of that as well is really important. And I think, there's some folks that are really thinking differently about how they use those assets. Some that stand out, you mentioned the port in Kansas City, the port in Cincinnati, and the bond issues they have done around buying portfolios at scale and those opportunities, I think is really visionary. Is a great model for folks to copy. We've been talking with folks in Texas about thinking about that model and trying to take a page out of that book, possibly for direct ownership, but also potentially as a sort of a high volume capital source to be able to access the municipal markets, to be able to provide attractive capital in ways that they understand what the ownership trajectory is and how it benefits people in their community. Because as the city as an institution has that long time horizon, they can think about what fully amortized capital can do. And I think that, we've been working a lot in Atlanta, and the Atlanta's mayor's office is also really, really tremendous in the way they're thinking about kind of housing channels broadly and how to bring housing online, taking care of the supply that they have, bringing more online. I think it really is sort of an example of the kind of vision that can be helpful there. The one other thing I'd say is that, I worked for years with someone who would often say, capital isn't immoral, it's amoral. And I think that while I argued that point to the ground with him, but I see a bit of what he was saying, in that when you start to look at some of these big REITs and some of these big owners, particularly the publicly traded ones, you start to see that these are in people's 401ks, or you have teacher and firefighter pensions that are in these funds, and so there's not as simple as it's more of a systemic problem than sort of who those owners are, because it's so securitized. But I think what's really important at the local level is sort of setting those sideboards, right? Aggressive code compliance. Like what can you do legally or get away with in a way that creates, quote, market returns? Because when we try and do some things that are more community focused and community facing, that's always the basis of comparison. And I can walk you through some properties that were delivering market returns and then ask, is that what you want your money to be creating in these communities? So I think it is important that there's sort of a playing field that when folks are investing, they're investing with integrity and doing right by the folks who are living in those homes. And then from there have a spectrum that everyone can live with in terms of what returns might look like.
Thank you. That's a great scan of a lot of innovation and important work around the country. Appreciate your mentioning the role of non-traditional partners like port authorities, the importance of long-term and affordable capital, and of course, local code enforcement and other regimes that help ensure that investments benefit tenants and communities. So I want to make sure that there's time for attendees' questions. So just want to give the panel a chance to speak directly to each other. We have different sort of facets of the work represented, from research to organizing and tenant power to creating scalable strategies to put homes and into resident and community control. So what would you kind of ask of each other? What kinds of things might make it easier for groups like the ones that are represented in this panel to work together toward to make progress and create shared solutions? So anybody should ask any.
I can start us off. We've been lucky in our work to be able to partner with community land trusts and tenant organizers, and we've seen how they're able to support tenants and keep them in their homes, and how our work can support them. So I think my question for you both is there specific research or data that would be really valuable to the work that you do that you don't have now? What is it that you're looking for, and how could research partners start to fill that gap?
I have one answer to that, at least from the seat that I sit in, and that is, that we a lot of the research really delves into the data that's available and kind of that backward looking, but also how can we start to use some of that to be a little bit more forward looking. At the top, Lou was mentioning that the folks with ready access to capital were quickly buying up properties during the foreclosure crisis. Those of us with enough gray hair and hair lost have, were also there in 2008 trying to advocate for similar things, but there wasn't the research base, there wasn't the political cover, there wasn't, there weren't the resources to help electeds and folks in the public sector and even folks in the philanthropic sector sort of step up and be as sort of opportunistic and aggressive when those opportunities were breaking. And it wasn't until many years later that folks were getting comfortable there. So I think that would be my answer to that question. And then more broadly, just while I'm on the mic, I might just say to the organizing side and the research side, let's really see some of these things through in a collaborative way together. So we've been working some in Minneapolis where there's definitely an organizing phase, there's an acquisition phase, but there's some of these pieces that are stronger if they're braided together and more longitudinal. And so now on the ownership side, we're having conversations about, well, how do we better connect with the tenants, and how do we make them aware of the resources that are available to them for down payment assistance, and that we sort of lost some of that connection with the organizing side. And so if we can think early and often about how to reinforce each other's work, how the transactional folks more transactionally focused can help sort of clarify the ask of the organizing groups. I think there's a way that we can make a lot of this stronger, more durable, more impactful, and more replicable.
Reporting live from Minneapolis, where I'm in the offices of Inquilinos Unidos. Shout out to an amazing tenant organization here. And I think, they're actually a great example, Devin, of a group that's worked very closely with organizations like yours to see some of these organizing efforts through to a whole other way of existing, where we're not actually dependent on a private sector landlord. So the things that I would ask of these two and, a lot of the folks listening into the webinar, I think one is obviously we're kind of early in our journey of becoming housing finance curious. And we have a lot to learn still. And, we've kind of like come up a steep learning curve in the last couple of years on the secondary mortgage market and reading balance sheets and all of this type of stuff. And as has been covered on this call, there's a lot of housing finance information that is just not available to us. So we need partners to help find some of that stuff that is not available in public data sets or whatever, and help us make some sense of it. There's one-off research requests coming in all the time now from tenant organizations across the country. And I see that, both as like a headache that I have to like figure out how to deal with on a day-to-day basis, but also an amazing sign of like real sophistication entering into our strategic space. And that's amazing. And I really invite, and I hope so many of you join us as we continue learning on that side. And then I think and just to put a fine point on that, because there was an amazing question about rent strikes in the Q&A component. It's not enough to just say there are more tenants than there are landlords. If we want to get serious about winning, we have to get serious about leverage, and tenants' economic power ultimately is our rent. But in order to exercise that power, we really need to understand our landlords' financing. And so that's kind of the why behind why we need a lot more sophistication on that side than we currently have, including, when we're taking a building on strike within a landlord's whole portfolio, what we've learned, painfully in the last year or so is that sometimes, even if we're putting them in the red on that one building, it doesn't matter, because they've got this whole portfolio, and actually they were counting on losses in components of their portfolio to begin with. So it's that level of sophistication that I think for many people on this call, that's like, duh. For us, we're still learning, and that's kind of the why behind why we need some extra sophistication there. And then to Devin's point about the more forward-looking need, the multifamily market is in a state of flux, and there's a lot of over leverage. There's a lot of LIHTC sunsetting. There's all sorts of stuff like that could create crises at any moment. And I think what we need is people like you all helping us discern signal from noise and understand a crisis moment when we're in one soon enough for us to do something about it. Because of course, in crisis is opportunity. And, unfortunately, I think many of us have lived through many layers of crisis in the last couple of years, but I think the tenant movement is now better positioned than we've ever been to actually respond in a crisis moment. And really what we need is your assistance in discerning when that moment occurs and what is to be done.
Thank you. Thank you all. So we have a really well attended webinar and a really active Q&A. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, but we'll make an effort in perhaps working with Irvin to respond as we send some follow-up. Let me put out a couple of questions at a time, I guess, and panelists can jump in and respond as they feel moved. So one question kind of gets back to what I was asking earlier in terms of local policy solutions. So the question is, are there current, and I would add maybe proposed laws that kind of differentiate between large corporate owners and smaller landlords in terms of trying to limit the benefits that go to larger landlords and, as Devin's been saying, prioritize benefits to smaller actors or individual homeowners. Where are you seeing promise there, or any policies that you might point to that are successful and could be replicated?
I can start here. I don't know that I've seen anything successful yet in this field, but it's something we've talked about throughout our research around limits on the number of properties someone can own by size. I think there's a proposal in New York around something similar. And on our Homes for Profit panel, we had Brian On, who's a researcher from Atlanta, who had proposed something similar. And I think Atlanta's had similar regulation, but thinking about if we can understand the true size of these portfolios, then does it make sense to have policy that limits how many units, how many buildings, what dollar amount somebody can own, and like how much control an individual corporation can have in a given municipality or state?
Devin or Tara, anything you want to put forward on the regulatory or policy side?
You know, I don't have great examples. I feel like our federal policy team has circulated a few things that have come up from different Senate offices, and that we kind of try and, you know, pressure test and poke holes in. I think that there's often so many, as was pointed out earlier on, so many structuring ways around a lot of these things that I think it's very, very hard to get that size just as the metric. And so there might be some other levers, like where, you know, kind of more of a, like I've said before, more of a code enforcement or more of a financial orientation, some other ways just besides size alone. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that, you know, before we had big landlords that were vilified, you know, a lot of folks were talking about sort of smaller neighborhood folks that were local but not operating with integrity and not providing high quality properties. And I think that there's still needs to be a recognition that regardless of size, you might have some of the same negative outcomes because folks are still investing for profit and in some case to the detriment of other things. So I think being mindful of scale, but not being overly focused on scale is important as we think about how to regulate in communities.
Yeah, that's a good point. So not just the who, but the how and what are the mechanisms of harm that you want to be counteracting. So here's a question about data availability and transparency, and it kind of flows a little bit from everyone's comments. But what are data that states or counties or municipalities collect on ownership? And are there ways that that information can be kind of leveraged to shed more light on the identities of owners? Where are you seeing good practice? What would you like to see in a kind of transparency regime?
I can start us here as well. In Massachusetts, that data is collected by the state around corporate filings. If you're a tenant, you can look up the LLC that's listed on your rent, or I mean on your lease, or your landlord's name on your lease, and you can understand what LLCs and corporations that person's connected to. The problem we have on the research side is that is through a like one-off search tool, and what we need to be able to do this research at scale is access to that data in bulk, to let us really connect these whole networks across the state. And that's where we've had a problem, on our end of things, at least.
I might comment maybe less on the data source and more on the analysis and what we find helpful. I think that there's some of those things that really help tell the story of the neighborhood that's helpful. I think sometimes you have an opportunity to buy investor-owned property in neighborhoods where that's a little bit of an anomaly. And I think that you have sometimes opportunities to buy in places where that's really the norm. And sometimes the majority are investor-owned rentals. And so I think just kind of helping understand place so we can understand trajectory is really helpful. So some of the stuff, some of the stuff in Minneapolis was really helpful, done by the university up there. So I think that this like that sort of piecing together and that storytelling about what that investment means in place is something that we find really helpful, both to orient ourselves and figure out what makes sense and what's actionable going forward, but then also to orient others and on the capital side that we're trying to bring along.
The only thing I would add is that I think this is another area where I want for more vision and proactivity from the public sector. What we found when we were doing all of this federal work in the last several years is that HUD was not talking to FHFA, was not talking to Treasury. There was no understanding across agency about which landlords and developers were benefiting from which streams of public financing and subsidy. And I think the same thing is true at the local level. My observation of Kansas City is that it's very infrequently the case that the Port Authority understands the role of the city, all of these different streams. And I think that's actually critical to both tenants' understanding of the financing behind their landlords, but also critical to then the public sector's understanding of its potential leverage in partnership with tenants to hold landlords accountable and to push for better in their community.
Thank you so much for all of those reflections. Thank you so much to the panelists, to Leah, to Urban. We're going to wrap up. Wish we had more time. We're going to post the video on urban.org, send out resources and slides. Please do take a shot of this to give us feedback. And on behalf of LISC and Urban, thanks to everyone for this really critical conversation, and hope everyone has a good rest of their day. Thanks all.